We are going to open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. We'll open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. And look at verses 43 through 48. It says here, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." So this to me is the key really brings us to the key of the whole Sermon on the Mount. Whole Sermon on the Mount. I feel like this is at least one of the great keys to it. And I think it's appropriate to discuss when we talk about taking God seriously, because this is one of the hardest areas I find to take God seriously is in loving our enemies. So Jesus says to love your enemies, and if we take him seriously, we'll do what he says. Love is a verb, not an adjective. So we use love a lot of times to describe a feeling or emotion that we have. And when we hear love your enemies, well, we think that we have to have an emotional connection to our enemies. We have to have an emotional connection to them. No, you don't. Kind of like I used to have one lady in our church when I was just starting out. And she used to say, she was always kind of a sour puss, She had a scowl on her face all the time. And she would say, "Preacher, Jesus says I have to love him, but that don't mean I have to like him." It used to make me laugh. But I think what she was saying was that, yes, I have to love them. That doesn't mean I have to have an emotional connection with them or for them. And frankly, Jesus didn't go to the cross because of an emotional compulsion to do so. His love was far deeper than that. Emotional compulsion doesn't lead people to do something like die on the cross for our sins. I think about that, especially on Memorial Day weekend, as we think about those who died in service of our country, us nation. I think about they didn't do that because they felt warm and fuzzy about it. They did that out of a deeper love and obligation and moral imperative, really. So what do y'all think about that, about this concept, the first few verses through verse 45 there, where he says, "Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you." So when he says love your enemies, and he describes to us how to do that. So you ask the question, how do I love my enemy? Jesus says, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. That's how you love your enemy, by doing these things. Talk to me about that a little bit. How hard is that?
I don't know of anybody that I would consider to be my enemy.
You don't have any enemies right now in your life, do you?
I mean, if somebody may say that I'm their enemy, but if they do, I don't know it. And there's nobody that I would.
Nobody you know that's your enemy right now. Yeah. That's a good blessing place to be. That's a blessed place to be. How about y'all? What do you think about that?
I sometimes think about the people who are against our country, not me personally, not my personal enemy, like next door or something. But
Yeah.
what about those people that persecute our country, our church, wrecking our country with all the evil in it? Aren't those our enemies?
And to both of your point, you have enemies you don't know. And you have enemies you don't know because just because you're a follower of Jesus, there are people that hate you. There are people that hate you and do not want good things for you because you're a follower of Jesus, because you stand for what is morally right. So just because you don't know them doesn't mean you don't have them, even if they don't know you. If they did, they'd hate you because you love Jesus. And sometimes that's all it takes to make an enemy is you love Jesus. And I have made enemies because I love Jesus. And I've made enemies because I'm a human being who messes up things, and some people have a hard time accepting that and showing any grace. So I've made enemies because of my own mistakes as well. So it's not always because we love Jesus that we make enemies. Sometimes we make enemies due to our own fault and our own bad behavior, or our own misdirected actions, where we didn't do what was right, even though we were trying, even though you were trying to do what was right. So I have a number of enemies, and I've always had several at different times in my life. And I do find it difficult to love them. I find it hard. So what do you think about that? Why is it hard to love those people who hate you, who hate this country, who hate everything that we stand for as followers of Jesus? Why is it hard to love them?
And is it easier to forgive somebody like that you don't know than it is your next door neighbor who has hurt you or something?
Boy. Yeah, is it easier to forgive them than it is somebody you know closely that you don't like, disagree with? Boy, I think so. I think that's a lot harder sometimes.
A coworker that you have to see every day.
Or that boss
Yeah.
that might not like you. How can we pray for our enemies? What can you pray for your enemies about? How can you pray for your enemies?
If they're lost, pray for their salvation.
Yeah, if they're lost, pray for their salvation, for sure. You know, I find it helpful sometimes when I'm praying for my enemies to pray that God will bless them in ways they need to be blessed. Sometimes my enemies might be people who are absolutely opposed to God. And they're absolutely wanting to destroy the things of God. That might be my enemy. So how do you pray for God to bless them? Boy, that's tough, isn't it? But you have to understand the blessings of God. Sometimes the blessing of God is it's truly a blessing for someone to lose everything they have and wind up on rock bottom so that they will seek God, find Him, and spend eternity with Him in heaven. So you pray these prayers for your enemies that are like, Lord, do whatever it takes, even if that means taking everything away from them, so that they will find and follow Christ. That seems like a harsh thing to say because you don't want people to have to go through suffering. But I would rather they go through suffering here than suffer for all eternity. And if it means their salvation, at the end of all of that, they might even say, man, I'm sure glad I lost everything so that I might gain Christ. That's what Paul said. Paul said, man, I'm glad I lost everything so that I might gain Christ. So sometimes praying for people, praying for God to bless your enemies can look different than you think. It does. For example, you might have an enemy that is succeeding financially and it's pushing them further away from Christ. It's okay to pray that God blesses them by taking that away from them so that they will follow Christ. Think about the soul, not the physical, when you pray for God's blessing, is my point. If you pray for the soul of the person to be blessed, that's a different story. And you say, well, how do I pray for wisdom for someone why would I want God to give them wisdom for my enemy? Well, wisdom for your enemy would be to make things right with you, wouldn't it? Wisdom for your enemy would be for them to start living differently, wouldn't it? So it's okay to pray for wisdom for your enemy. It's okay to pray for the blessing of the soul of your enemy. And this is the hard part. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you. Ooh. Do good to them. That's hard. That's hard to say, I'm going to do good for them when they don't deserve it. Yet that's exactly what Jesus did for us. He did good for us when we didn't deserve it. And he says, do good for those who hate you and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Now imagine how hard that is for someone who lives in real persecution. Not even persecution like we endure a mild persecution, but what about those who live under real persecution? An enemy that is just abusive every single day. And here Jesus says, pray for them. Pray for them. What makes sense, because he's the only one that can change their heart. And if he changes their heart, that persecution will end, won't it? They'll no longer be persecutors. So that's a tough one. But he says, here's why we're to do this. He says, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, and that sons or daughters of your Father in heaven, for he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. So he said the reason we ought to do this is because we need to be like God. And God blesses this world. God blesses this world. He makes it to rain on the just and the unjust. You got a farmer right here that loves the Lord, gives to the Lord, and helps out his neighbor, and the rain comes on his crop. And you got a farmer right next to him, and he is nasty, mean, and ornery, and doesn't help anybody, and gets angry if anybody comes near his property. And yet God blesses him with rain on his crop as well. And these things are so that they might bring people to Christ, So, what do y'all think about that so far, this command to love your enemies?
I think there's different kinds of love. I mean, the love you have for your mom is not the same love you have for your next door neighbor or, a friend. And I think it's kind of the same way with your enemy. If you have forgiven them, no matter if they're your enemy, if you've forgiven them, you've got some kind of a love between you.
That's good, Cookie, yeah. Yeah. I think there is a different kinds of love too, isn't there? I also think it's a process. It's something that we have to work towards. It's not something that necessarily comes overnight. But it's something that Jesus does in us and through us. And we'll get to that at the end of the lesson about how God does that in us and through us. Because that really is the core of it, is that He enables us to do what we can't do naturally. You think about someone who has a real severe enemy who's been severely wronged by them, maybe even all their life. And they learn to love that individual. Well, that is just because of Jesus in them. That's it. That's only because Jesus does it through us. And we'll get to that part in a minute. But he goes on to say this in verse 46 and 47. He says, "For if you love those who love you," like the love you were talking about for your mother, "for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same?" So, if you love only those who love you, what reward do you have? He says, "And if you greet your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so?" So when it comes to this, he expects us, he says, he poses really two interesting questions here. And one is, if you love those only who love you back, do you really expect God to reward you for that? That's just a very human kind of love. Doesn't go the extra mile. So God's like, I'm not going to reward you just for loving people who love you back. He says, and then the second question is, if you only talk to your friends, how are you different from sinners? God's standard for those who have experienced His love is higher. He expects more of His children. If you greet only those who greet you, if you greet only those who greet you, he says, this is harder than it sounds. It means you can't pretend you don't see them in the grocery store. It's hard to greet someone when you pretend they don't exist. So, here's how this plays out in our lives. You're going down the grocery store aisle at Walmart, and you see that person who has wronged you going down the opposite way over there, or that person who just, maybe they haven't done anything wrong to you, but they're a scoundrel. You just know they're a scoundrel. And you're like, I don't want to see that person. I don't want to talk to that person. So what do? You cut down the other aisle and you say, maybe if I pretend I don't know them, maybe they'll pretend they don't know me and we'll get along just fine. I have done that myself. I have done it myself. So here is the problem with that. Jesus says don't do it. And that's enough. Jesus says don't do that. Jesus says don't act like that. He says if you greet your brethren only, you're no different than the sinners. You're no different than a lost person if you greet your brethren only. What about that person that maybe you don't know, but you look at them, and by the way they're dressed, and the way they act, and the way they carry themselves, you automatically go the other way. You're like, I don't want any part of that person. He said if we do that, We're no different than the sinners. I remember being in a situation where I had some enemies one time, and I hadn't seen them in a long time. I tell you what, I read this passage one morning, and God told me in my devotional time, He said, now you're going to run into them soon. When you do, I want you to talk to them. And I said, yes, Lord, I will do that. And I did, but it was hard. It was hard to not just ignore them. So when we do that, we're acting like Jesus. When we do that, when we greet those who persecute us, when we greet those who hate us, when we do good for those who use us, when we do good for those who persecute us, when we love those who hate us, we are being like Jesus. It's what we need to do. But it's really, really tough sometimes. So the task would be to think about if there's anyone like that in your life or any class or category of people that you see, you come across in your life that you treat that way. Don't treat them that way. Has anybody ever treated you that way? Have you ever been treated like that? Have you? I have. I know I've been treated that way at times, for sure. And think about how you're going to respond next time you see them. How you're going to respond next time you run into somebody like that. Because we can't say we take God seriously if we don't obey Him in these things. Now, the next verse, I think, is the key to interpreting the entire Sermon on the Mount. Let's read it again. Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So Jesus says very plainly to be as perfect as God the Father. So this is the key verse of the Sermon on the Mount. And you can't explain it away or over-spiritualize it or say that Jesus was just kind of alluding to something here. It's what God requires of us. God requires perfection. It's also why He sent Jesus to fulfill the perfect requirement. He knew we could not live out His requirements, so He did it for us and lived the perfect life. Then He took our sin on Himself and paid the price for our sin in full, and He rose from the grave to provide the living proof of our salvation. So, this is why this is key to interpreting the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us things like this. He tells us things like this. If your right eye offends you, pluck it out. He says things like this. He says, love your enemies. He says, if someone compels you to go with them a mile, go with them 2 miles. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them your other cheek. If someone asks of you, give to them whatever they ask. If someone asks for your coat, tell them to take my shirt also. That's what Jesus says. And then He says this. He says, also in the Sermon on the Mount, He says, how about this? He said, I say to you, forgive people. I say to you, He says, in one portion here in the Sermon on the Mount, He says, if you even look at a woman to lust after her, you have committed adultery against your wife or your husband, respectively. If you even think about and hate someone in your heart, you've already murdered them in God's eyes. That's a high standard of perfection. So when Jesus taught this Sermon on the Mount, He was teaching this Sermon on the Mount, and He was telling them, okay, you want to get to heaven. Okay, you want to be a good Christian. You want to be a follower of God. You want to do what's right. Here's the standard. Be perfect like God. And you could almost hear the gasp in the room as he taught there on that hillside. Because obviously no one could live up to the teaching. And see, that's the point of the Sermon on the Mount. The point of the Sermon on the Mount is to give us, I think, three things. One, a standard of living in the millennial kingdom, and that deals with prophecy in the future. Two, to give us a standard to shoot for and something to strive for as Christians here on this earth. We've got to try to live this way. But the third, and I think most profound point of the Sermon on the Mount is that you can't, and that I can't, and that being perfect isn't on the table. One can't do it. And that's why Jesus did it. He did it for us. He was trying to tell the people of that day, look, living after the law, you're never going to get to heaven. Living your own way, your own standards, you're never going to get there. You have got to actually just trust Him, because He's the only one who has lived the perfect life. You can live up to that perfect standard of following Jesus and following the Word of God. He's the only one that has lived up to that perfect standard of being like God, because He is God. So, how would it change how we see our enemies if we saw them the way that Jesus saw them? If we saw them as someone for whom Jesus died? So this is what I try to do whenever I'm thinking about loving my enemies. One of the things that helps you about that is to remember that Jesus died for them also. To remember that Jesus died for their sins they committed against you. They sinned against you. Jesus died for that. He sinned against them even more. And Jesus died for that. So knowing that the person that is your enemy is someone for whom Jesus died and someone the Father loves, helps us to love our enemies when we see them in God's eyes. So the bottom line is to love our enemies, because to do less is to ignore His command to do so. And the response of my assignment is to ask God in prayer to help you love your enemy and be obedient to however He tells you to love them. So, any thoughts on this lesson today? Or any questions about it?
It's hard.
It's hard to do. It is.
I worked with someone once that said that you can't pray for someone every day and hate them. So if you've got somebody that we don't like, then pray for them every day. And then,
Boy, that's the truth. You can't pray for someone every day and hate them still. It changes. It changes to compassion for them. It changes to pity for them. It changes to love for them. You begin to see them through God's eyes the more you pray for them. That's, it's easy to do if someone ran into your car in Walmart parking lot and sued you and treated you badly. Hard to do if it's someone in your family who's been abusive to you. Hard to do if it's someone who maybe murdered or harmed one of your family members. How do you love them? How do you love them? And that can only be done through the power of Christ. It can't be done in our own human strength. It can only be done in the power of Christ. But if you pray for them, He'll help you. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, we'll come back and be back online with these studies in the fall. We'll be back in the fall in August and be back live again. And I appreciate everybody watching online as well.